Hi, Dr. Tan. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Excited today to talk about personal statements and red flags, of course. Um, we're going to go ahead and just jump right in. So I'm going to let you start and give everybody an introduction to who you are, your match process, and your personal statement, and the red flags that you had to talk about in your statement.
Sure. So, hi everyone. I'm Cynthia. I've met some of you. I haven't met some of you. I am starting anesthesiology residency tomorrow. It's very exciting, but also very, very scary. So I match in March, and I am a non-US IMG. I graduated from medical school in England in 2018. So that's the first of, I guess, my red flags or my flags because I was an older graduate, I guess. And oh, and my other things that I spoke about in my personal statement was my lower than expected step score, especially for an IMG applying into anesthesiology. Um, so those were two big things that I had to address on my personal statement.
Okay. Do you want to talk about what the process of writing the personal statement was like, especially when it comes obviously to those red flags, and if it was hard for you to write about them or different approaches that you thought about maybe taking?
Sure. So I really thought about as to whether or not I should speak about my red flags, especially with anesthesiology being quite a competitive field. Stat scores were important. So I was like, oh, do I talk about it? Do I not? Do I just leave it and let them figure it out and ask me about it? Because the stat score obviously was on my application. Um, and after just debating and brainstorming multiple times, like in my personal statement, like why I want to do anesthesia, or like what just all the aspects of writing a personal statement, I decided just to go for it head on because if I personally felt if I had addressed it head on and spoke about it, that shows that I was kind of owning my my red flags and I was owning what my flaws were, and then I can show them from owning that how I have improved or how I can do better, and just show them characters of my characteristics and traits of myself that they may not see just from my application.
Sure. And that really goes along with the kind of conventional advice that if you have some red flags, you should address them, just put them out there in the statement. Like you said, just to kind of own the mistake if you consider it a mistake, and take responsibility for it and then show what you learned from it. So that was a great idea, I think, to go ahead and address your particular red flags. Like you said, your red flags were a little bit of a delay in starting residency and then your step two score. Would we talk a little bit more specifically about how you did choose to address those in your personal statement?
Sure. So I'll start my step one score. I actually just wrote my score. So I just wrote the three-digit number on my personal statement, and then I followed up with um, how I felt. So I was honest. I shared my disappointment with that score, especially knowing that anesthesia required a higher score. And I went on to explain why I felt that was still an achievement in itself because I was doing it on top of clinical rotations. I was learning a whole different like curriculum to what I was used to in the UK. So by showing them that, I think they were like, oh, okay, she worked hard, like, and she still passed, especially with step one becoming pass fail soon. Like, if I had applied in 2 years' time, it would have been a pass, and they wouldn't have seen the three-digit score. Um, so showing them that I worked hard, I still managed to pass. I did all of these things, still scored like pretty well for my med school, and and then I think it also showed like resiliency because I went on to saying yeah, I eventually really improved my step 2 CK, and addressing it was great because it came up in my interviews. Many of my interviewers said, I know you were worried about your step score, but like you pass, and if you show me that you can work hard and be a good resident, that's what I want, and working hard will get you through residency. So I was like, wow, like addressing it was a good idea.
Yeah, definitely. And that's feedback that I've heard before too, is that when you go ahead and give a little bit of explanation in your personal statement about whatever your red flag might be, it gives the opportunity during an interview for the interviewers to ask you some questions, and they have more targeted questions that allow them to ask you what they really want to know because you've kind of given them already the basics. So yeah, I think your strategy was really great. When you were putting together the personal statement, after you decided that you would include your red flags, did you think about where to include them? I sometimes get questions about, should I start with it, like first paragraph, just put it out there right away, or should I, talk about it a little bit later, or should it be the last thing? So what were your ideas as you were putting things together?
That's a really good question. So when I first wrote my personal statement, like my very first draft, it was the first paragraph. It was the first sentence of my personal statement, and it was just my score to start off the whole personal statement. And when I got feedback from my mentors and a couple of friends, they were like, "Why are you trying to sell yourself short from the beginning?" And I was like, "Oh, I guess I just thought I would talk about it from the start and be honest and not be afraid about it." They're like, "Yeah, you can still do that, but why don't you start with cooler things, or like things that would grab their attention?" I was like, "Oh, but my step score will grab their attention." They're like, "Yeah, but there are other things. Think about other things." So I changed it to the second paragraph, and then changed it to the third paragraph, and eventually I left it at the third paragraph. Which so I just spoke about why I wanted to do anesthesia, like my background, and then went into about what I thought was the issue, and why I'm writing about it. So I think that was definitely a solid advice, and I would also share this with everyone else who's listening in. Don't sell yourself short from the start, because there are so many other great aspects and great things about you that you can talk about before addressing your red flags.
Yeah, and I want to offer my advice and opinion on that too. Before I do that, I'll explain to all of our viewers who've tuned in. Thank you. So I'm the director of communications with Match a Resident, but I've also for the last 6 years been an editor and a writer with Residency Statement. So I have a lot of experience in working with IMGs who do have red flags, and red flags can really range, from something very minor, like maybe, needing to take a gap year for a very legitimate reason, to having, a more serious red flag, like maybe multiple attempts on step one and step two. And I've even encountered IMGs who have had issues, legal issues in the past and things that they really needed to explain and address within their personal statement. So I want to confirm what you just said, that we do want to go ahead and put certain red flags right in our statement and address them. And I am going to talk about too what red flags maybe you don't need to address in a personal statement. But when you have decided that you're going to address a red flag, it is really smart to address it in the lower half of the statement. I like to visualize the one-page document and think about the top half being where we want to emphasize everything that's really excellent. And like you said, your cool attributes and all the things that make you a really strong candidate. You want to impress them right off the bat. And then as you filter downward towards the bottom of your personal statement, that's where it's a good idea to bring these other items in, things that maybe aren't so great or things that require some additional explanation. And because the document is so short, it's just one page, it's not like you're trying to hide it or pushing it off till the end. Like, we're only talking about 700 or 800 words. So it really does make sense to situate it more toward the bottom if we think of it as a funnel effect, starting with the good stuff and keeping that big at the top, and then funneling down to something that's a little bit less pleasant to talk about toward the end, but not in the last paragraph, right? So the last paragraph, we make a turnaround and draw their attention back to all the positive attributes. That's a writing technique where we want to start off really strong and then also end really strong to leave them thinking positively rather than about the red flags. Do you feel like when you were writing your personal statement, if you had had access to a coach or someone like me, are there any questions that you might have asked as far as needing advice?
Yeah, so I think a very common question is that I get asked, and I know people have asked me as well, and also I saw a question on the chat. What do we consider red flags? because for me, I was like, oh yeah, these things are my red flags, and it's what my mentor thought were, concerning traits of my application. But to some people, that may not be a red flag. So how do we kind of determine what's a red flag and what isn't a red flag?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that I actually do encounter a lot. So you mentioned that your mentor indicated that your red flags could be concerning, and it is really excellent advice to talk to your mentor and talk to your peers and your colleagues to get those varied opinions, because at the end of the day, you have to make the decision. It's your personal statement, and you're in charge of that content. So reaching out and getting as much advice and input as you can before making your decision is really important. And as far as what actually is a red flag, that's going to vary too from specialty to specialty. Some specialties have very, very, high expectations in terms of scores, or maybe having multiple attempts would be not a great factor. So you definitely need to address it. Whereas in other specialties, things that are for instance, if you got a step 2 score of 210 for a very competitive specialty, like in your instance with anesthesiology, you might want to address that. In a less competitive specialty, it's not necessarily a red flag. So it is important to consider your specialty and where you're going. I think the top 3 things that are red flags that absolutely should be addressed in a statement is having a lower score, having multiple attempts on either step 1 or step 2, and then if you had to take time off during medical school. So if you had to delay a semester, or anything of that nature that caused you to not follow the normal trajectory of your 4-year path, that would deserve some space in the personal statement. The problems with not addressing those issues are that you leave your reader wondering why these things happened. So especially with the case of having an interruption in school, they want to know what was the reason. And they want to know to a certain extent. That's the other important detail. They don't want to read a full paragraph or more than one paragraph about the reason that you had to take time off, or even why you had multiple attempts. And sometimes there's very legitimate reasons, illness and death in your immediate family, or even a personal illness or an injury that you sustained. Sometimes there's financial hardships that come into play that simply affect your ability to study for and be well prepared to take the exams. And, it's not always I would say it's typically not a reflection of an applicant's actual capabilities when they have multiple attempts, or they score on the lower end of things. It's just something prevented them from being in the right mind frame or having the capacity to prepare. And that's a learning curve for many applicants. So when you don't address those things, or I should say, I guess I was talking more about over addressing those things. When we over address those things, the statement takes a turn, and it takes a turn away from your strengths and why you want to pursue the specialty. And instead, it becomes kind of a long excuse for why this happened. And you're almost trying to talk your way out of it. And it can come across like you're not taking responsibility for it.
Yes.
That's one thing, yeah, that you want to be very, very careful about, is not pushing the blame onto someone else. Even if it was somehow someone else's fault or some circumstances you couldn't control, it still reflects back on you. So we want to, when you're putting together that paragraph that's describing your red flags, immediately take responsibility and ownership over whatever the red flag might have been, and then move forward with how you overcame it and how you will not make the same mistake going forward.
Yeah, definitely. And like you said, if you don't address it and you leave your readers wondering, that does take up a lot of time on your interviews as well, because they want to talk about that, and then they don't get an opportunity to get to know you and other like positive things about you. So
Exactly. And one thing to consider too is that when the program directors are reviewing your application, they are seeing your scores and your time of graduation and all of these things. They're seeing that up front, and then they're making the decision to look further into your application to read about your personal statement. So they've already decided there's something about you that they like on paper and want to know more. So it's important not to think of the personal statement as, this is my way in the door. Really, it's your criteria that are your way in the door, and then your readers will read that personal statement when they want to learn more about you. So you're already in a good place if they're reading that personal statement. So you want to be thinking positively, like, these people like me, they want to know more about me, and let me show them all the best stuff, and then offer that explanation, because they're interested and curious.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I'm seeing a lot of questions come in here. So I
Yeah.
want to, oops,
Um,
I'm
we can start
looking
from the
for,
top, and I could read out the questions for us if you want.
sure.
Um, okay, so the first question that I see is, that's a lot of thank you for this session and hope we save it. I think we will save this, so you'll be able to access this again. So the first one was, what are the red flags that don't need to be in the personal statement?
Sure. So red flags that don't need to be in a personal statement, kind of, we talked a little bit about that. You might think that you have a low score, but if your score isn't truly low as for the field or specialty that you're applying to, it may not be a red flag. So you want to take a look, for instance, like on the Match a Resident website, on one of our front pages called Our Specialties, we have listed the average USMLE scores for applicants who have matched into certain specialties. So if your score is within the 5-point range of the average of people matching in, then it's not low, and it's not something you need to spend time addressing in a personal statement. So a low score always has to be qualified as low in some concrete way. Don't just decide on your own that it's maybe lower than what you wanted, but that doesn't mean that it's considered lower for your specialty. So that's probably the number one, I think, mistake that I see, is candidates wanting to address a score that's not truly low.
Yeah.
Another thing that's usually not necessary to address is if you had, like, let's say you had to repeat just one course for whatever the reason may be. Your readers are typically not looking at your transcript as a decision-making factor. So that's not something that you need to bring up and elaborate on. Now, if you had several courses, or again, like that delay in actually getting through your medical school years, then you would want to bring it up. But if it was just a one-time thing, especially early on, MS1, MS2, then it's not something that you should take the time to explain.
Yeah.
And another item I'll throw in as a red flag that doesn't need to be addressed would be a personal issue that didn't really affect anything to do with your application. So this could be a mental health issue that you had, or possibly a legal issue, or something to do maybe with your family. If it didn't affect any part of your journey in a way that's evident in your application, then there's no reason to explain it. It's not a red flag unless it's part of your criteria. So sometimes applicants want to, share this major kind of not so great events that happened in their life, but there's no consequence in the application. So you want to stay away from touching on those topics if they have not affected your criteria.
Yeah. Yeah, and definitely with the Match a Resident tool, I think it's so great that you have the minimum stat score on there, and that's so helpful for everyone who wants to see, because I think most of us, like medical students and doctors, like with this whole imposter syndrome, for example, we're like, oh, we scored a 230, that's not good enough, and then you get this idea in your head that that's a low stat score when it really isn't. So definitely, like Tiffany said, definitely get a concrete example of what the score is for the program you're applying into or the specialty you're applying into, and use that as a gauge. Yeah. Okay, the second question that I can see related to this is being an IMG of 10 years of graduation a red flag?
So I think technically it is. If you have a long period or a long time since graduation, it's not a red flag in the same way that multiple attempts or a very low step score is, but it is something that your reader is going to want to know more about. So I think, I don't think of it as a red flag, but I do think of it as a topic that needs to be addressed in your statement. And ideally, you're going to be able to talk about all of the medically relevant things that you've done in your time since graduation. Yeah. If it's been, 1 year or 10 years, Hopefully you stayed very relevant. You've been gaining clinical experience or maybe research experience, and it is very important to explain that. That being said, within the ERIS application, you do have space to include all of your work since graduation. So if you have been staying medically relevant, then you're going to be listing that in your application, and you're going to have a space to talk about and describe those activities in your application too. So what we want to be careful of is not duplicating what's written in the written sections of the application in your personal statement, because that's not a good use of your space.
Okay. What about coming from a lesser known med school? Is that considered a red flag, especially with step one turning into pass and fail?
No, I don't consider that a red flag. And again, I'll kind of refer back to an answer I gave just a little bit ago. Your readers they already know what med school you're coming from. They're looking at your application package and they're seeing that right off the bat. So if that's a problem for them, then they're not going to dig deeper and read your personal statement. And that's not really something you can explain anyway. You know, it's hard to explain away why you are from a lesser known medical school without it coming across as a big excuse, essentially. So
Yeah,
my recommendation with that is be proud that you went to medical school and that you're
exactly.
graduating in time for the match. Don't there's no need to address that in your personal statement.
Yeah, and especially for IMGs, if you're ECFMG certified, your school was part of the ECFMG list, so you are on a recognized med school. So, like you said, be proud of the fact that you went to med school.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say that it's a non-issue. It's the opposite end of a red flag.
Okay, so we have another one about gap years. We just addressed about gap years and whether or not they're a red flag. Being a second author in a research paper, is that a red flag?
No, so that's not a red flag. And I saw another question pop in while we were talking too about is not having research a red flag? And it's really not a red flag. Unless, of course, you're hoping to go into, you're looking for a more research-based, like long-term position, and you're looking at a research type of university or program, then that would be a red flag. Because just as if you were wanting to go into surgery and you had zero, you never rotated through general surgery, that would be an issue. So not having a lot of research experience or being a second author in a published paper, that's not a red flag either. No.
Yeah, I agree with that because research is not a prerequisite for a lot of specialty. For some subspecialties, yes, but a lot of specialty research is not a prerequisite. It's just a bonus.
Yeah, exactly. It's a bonus. So if you have a lot of research and you published first author or second author, either way, that's great, and you can definitely highlight that in your statement. But again, that is something that you're going to be able to talk about in your ERIS application as well. So many candidates that I work with want to have, one or two paragraphs describing their whole research project and what they did. And it's really not appropriate because that's going to be present in your ERIS application. So it's a quick highlight of that information and that's it. And also, again, on our specialties page on the Match Resident site, beyond just the average USMLE scores for people who matched, we also include the average number of research experiences. So you can look at that specialty and see, is it 10 research experiences or is it maybe one? And that will give you a good indicator too on how important it is.
Okay, so another question was, so I paid for a service last year for a really good personal statement. Will it be boring for programs to see the same thing again without changes?
I do recommend making a change if you are applying for a second season. You don't have to completely rewrite the document. You hopefully have done some things, in the past year that will add to and strengthen your statement. So you want to go back in and revise that statement, add to what you had before, and look for ways that you can improve it. Writing is a very fluid and dynamic specialty of its own, and it's never finished, right? So no matter how strong your personal statement was last year, you can definitely improve upon it for the upcoming season.
I had a gap of 3 years doing a health informatics master's. Will this be a red flag?
A gap of 3 years doing what again?
A health informatics master's, sorry.
No, I wouldn't consider that necessarily a red flag. It's something that you'll want to explain, the reasons why, because that sounds like a decision, an intentional decision to take a break and go that direction. So you would want to offer an explanation why you decided to do that and how the experiences that you gained in those 3 years, how they have strengthened your application and how you're now even better prepared than you would have been had you not taken those years.
I also did a master's during my gap, and that was something I addressed on my personal statement. I was like, I had a gap, but then I chose to do a master's. And again, it came up in interviews. They're like, oh, yeah, we saw that you had a gap and you did a master's in public health. So, like, we know that you're hardworking. I was like, oh, yay.
Yeah, yes.
So,
That's another bonus actually is to have that additional to have the MPH is really just an added bonus. Yeah.
okay, should we address attempts on step exams? So we've addressed that and we said that we should talk about that. So,
Yeah.
I love Metro Resident. Thank you. We're
Beautiful.
Um, should we include more about hobbies or why we went into medicine in the personal statement?
So those are two very separate questions. I'll address both of them. Talking about hobbies is another thing that lots of candidates that I work with want to do. They say, well, I want to talk about that I like to cook, I like to travel, or maybe, they're video gamers, all sorts of different things. And again, I'm repetitive here, but the ARIS application has a section dedicated toward hobbies so that you can write about those hobbies in the ARIS application. And that's where it's appropriate to write about them. The only exception to that, when I think hobbies do belong in the personal statement, is when they are very closely tied to your specialty. So if you are applying for surgery and your hobby involves, very fine motor skills, like you make something arts and crafty or something, and it's closely aligned, you can really capitalize on that. How I guess the way that I usually like to put it is that even my interest outside of medicine strengthen my ability to be a good surgeon. And then you could talk a little bit about that hobby. But listing things like cooking and traveling and music and dance, it's, unfortunately, those are not unique hobbies and they're usually not particularly tied to a specialty. So it's not a good idea to waste space in the personal statement. And the second part of that question, remind me.
It says why we went into medicine.
Yeah, I think that that's a very important piece of content to include in your personal statement. I typically like to include it at the beginning. I think that most personal statements read best when they're written chronologically. So starting about why you went into medicine and then why you chose the specialty that you did. The mistake that I see happening a lot is applicants writing about why they went into medicine for the entire first paragraph or even into the second paragraph. And it's also important to kind of stray away from generic reasons like, growing up I had a doctor's kit and I always wanted to be a doctor. That's, it might be true.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of applicants something like that is very similar, or maybe their father was a physician and he inspired them to become a doctor, something like that. So if your reason for becoming a doctor is a very common reason, or what we could call a generic reason, you have to look for ways to personalize it and make it really unique and individual. If you don't have something that's going to stand out and make your reason for becoming a doctor unique and individual, I recommend just having a very simple opening, 1 or 2 sentences. I want to be a doctor because I want to help people. And of course, that's not exactly how I would phrase it, but don't spend a lot of time on it if it's not unique and very engaging. It's better to jump into strengths and characteristics and qualities that you have instead.
Yeah, I definitely that was definitely an advice that I got for my statement as well. And how, especially with the hobbies, like you said, I was like, oh, I could talk about the fact that I love to cook and I love yoga or whatever, but how did those things tie into my statement? And I realized it didn't, so I just left it out and then tied into, for me, anesthesiology, and one of my biggest hobbies is scuba diving, and I kind of tried to tie it up together, which I think gave it a bit of a narrative and it flowed nicely. So if you have a cool hobby that really does tie into your specialty, then find ways to work around tying it together and like creating a nice little story.
Yeah, and I think that's actually something I wanted to do was using a story or a narrative in your personal statement. There's a lot of different schools of thought on whether that's a good idea. And my experience, I think, has shown me that the right answer is somewhere in the middle. So a personal statement is a professional document. It's in the same genre as a cover letter that you would send with a resume or a CV. So it's not meant to be creative writing. There shouldn't be a great deal of dialogue and storytelling and description, if you will, within a personal statement. But there can be some amount of storytelling and description within a personal statement. And that usually works really well, kind of, Dr. Tan, as you did, as your opening, as your attention getter. So Dr. Tan had compared scuba diving to anesthesiology and did so in a way that was really cool, talking about actually being underwater and the feelings that you had, and then realizing that connection between the two activities. And that worked really well. I recommend limiting a descriptive type of narrative to just like half of your first paragraph. So really no more than maybe 50 to 100 words at the very most should be storytelling. And you certainly, I guess the same thing tends to happen with patient stories. So it's a really great idea to include a memorable patient story, a hands-on experience that you had that's relevant to the specialty you're applying to in your personal statement. It's not a good idea to turn that into a very dramatic and kind of overly told narrative, right? And as the nurses rushed in with a crash cart, I put my hands to my face and thought, oh, what will I do? Like, we don't want to. It's not a fiction narrative. So you want to kind of keep that very small. Those dramatic details. Just a line or two, and then transition into what you learned and why the experience was actually important. So that we're not storytelling. It's not the genre is not entertainment. So
The last thing is just whether or not being a non-US IMG is a red flag. And I kind of just want to say that it isn't, but I also want to add on to that. It definitely isn't, because non-US IMGs do make up a huge amount of doctors in the US.
you know what? I lost volume. I'm not hearing. I'm seeing you, but I'm not hearing you.
That's odd.
Nope. Let's see. Let me try.
Can you hear me now?
Um, Not really, but let me try something very quickly and
Can you hear?
go ahead and try again. Yes, now I can hear you.
Yeah. So the last question was whether or not being a non-US IMG was a red flag. So I was saying that it isn't, and that non-US IMGs do make up a huge, I guess, percentage of doctors in the US. But I'd also would love for you to add your thoughts to that.
My thoughts are really similar to when we talked about whether or not going to a lesser known medical school is a red flag. I say absolutely not. Being a non-US IMG is not a red flag. You are still a qualified applicant with experience, and you've completed medical school. So it's not a red flag, and it's not something that you want to like. But I think about how would we write about that in a personal statement. Any way that you approach it, you're going to kind of be putting yourself down, like saying, even though I am not from the US, I'm still all these things. Like it doesn't matter. We know that it is harder for non-US IMGs to match and that they face different challenges. But it's not a topic that warrants explaining. You don't have to explain, your country of origin or where you're from. That's just part of who you are. So it's not something that you should think of as a red flag or spend time talking about in your statement.
I think also, like, if they wanted to like, if they shared, like, I guess, a sentence or two why they want to come to the US, that could even be like a strong point, because like, I see all these great things about the US and that's why I want to be a part of it. And I think that could be like, oh wow, this person has really looked into it, or like looked into what we offer here, and they really do want to be a part of this system.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to bring up too, because aspect that a lot of candidates I work with want to know about. Like, should I include why I want to come to the US in my personal statement? And the answer is it depends. So if you have specific reasons, there's a very specific technology or research project or something that you can talk about, then yes, like you said, it shows that you've really done your homework and you have a very specific reason. Citing reasons like, the more generic, like the advanced access to the most advanced technology and best research, that's generic. That's why everybody wants to come to the US and do their residency. So your reasons got to be unique. Otherwise, it's kind of a waste of space to talk about it. And I do see a question popping in here, including research that you did during your pre-medical days. If the research is, so that says include it in your CV. So you can include it in your CV and in your application. If it's not medically relevant and if it's like from undergraduate school, then I would recommend not talking about it in your personal statement.
I think that's all the questions that I can see and read on the list.
Okay. Any last minute questions from everybody who tuned in? Anything else that we want to add in? I guess we'd be seeing them if there were. So, well, I think this is really helpful for everybody, and I think that we've been talking for just a little bit of time, and we covered a lot of content. But gosh, when it comes to personal statements, like there's just so many questions and so many different approaches and techniques that you can take. So if anyone who's watching, if you think of individual questions or if you have a specific question about your circumstances, you can feel free to come back and ask us on our Instagram account, send a direct message, or you can send an email. And Dr. Tan is one of our ambassadors, so you can reach out to her as well, ask her questions, and we're really, really happy to help.
Yeah, we're very happy to answer any questions. So
yeah, we're available all the time, so don't hesitate. I'm seeing one more pop in here. Should we talk about high school or early childhood stories as part of our background? So there's no yes or no answer to that question. It depends, right? It depends on if what you're writing about is actually relevant to where you're heading. So high school, I would say 9 times out of 10 is kind of a no-go. There's very, very few applicants who've done something important enough in high school to write about in your personal statement. But if you started volunteering at a hospital or a clinic, in high school, or you had some type of, injury in high school, or if you lost a friend maybe to an illness or something like that, then it can be appropriate, right? So that can be your inspiration or your reason for pursuing medicine. And then it's okay to talk about those, high school or childhood formative years, as long as you're tying things together. That's a good question. Now the questions are popping back in again. Can you see the list of them on your end at all?
I can. The last one for me is the being a non-US IMG. So I don't see anything else.
Okay, let me scroll through and just see what I see. Someone asked where you can get personal statement help. You can get personal statement help at residencystatement.com. That's one of Matcha Residence companies is residencystatement.com. So you can view that website, and you can you can reach out also to the support at residencystatement.com if you have questions about that. And you can reach me also directly just through Instagram direct messages. If you leave a message, just say, question for Tiffany, and they will make sure that it's, directed to me so that I can answer it for you. And let's see what else we have. Lots of thank yous. You're very, very welcome. Someone asked if being aged in the late 20s, I think, late 30s, being aged in the late 30s, is that a red flag? It can be. Some programs definitely like the younger candidates, and it's something that you can talk about. I typically address it just by pointing out, like, hey, I'm a non-traditional applicant, but that just means that I have years of maturity, and life experience that I can offer that younger candidates just can't. So I think it's important to call attention to that, but the key is also remaining humble. You would never want to come across as thinking that you're better than younger applicants or that you somehow can enter the program, with a higher level of placement just because you are older and have more life experience. So it's a delicate balance of pointing out this is a good thing that I'm a little bit older, while not going overboard and sounding too confident or arrogant about it. Let's see, the next one that's popping in, and this one isn't really relevant to personal statements, but I'm going to address it anyway. So the question is, does USCE location depend, let's see, does USCE location depends, clinical versus university? So as long as you're getting hands-on experience in the US, that counts as US clinical experience, whether it's at a outpatient clinic or it's at a university or within a hospital. Anything that you're doing within the US that you actually are directly working with patients does count as US clinical experience. So that's that.
But if they're kind of discussed, like if they want to talk about letters, like all kinds of USCs would be great because you get a US letter. Obviously, if you work in a university hospital setting, for example, then you may meet more people and have more network. So that's like the pros and cons for an outpatient versus a university hospital.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you for putting that in there. And next one is, how long should a personal statement be? So that's a very specific answer, and it should not be more than 1 page. Somewhere around the 700 word mark is really ideal. You could maybe be as low as 625 and still get a lot of information in, but really going over 800 is too long. And you don't want to risk that your reader's not going to finish reading it. And you have to remember, they're looking at hundreds, if not thousands, of applications and trying to read these personal statements. If you're exceeding 1 page, then odds are they'll skim it kind of quickly and move on. It's just not appealing when it's a longer document. And this next question says, for someone who hasn't had any USCE while in med school, how is it going to affect their chances of matching? It is important to have US clinical experience, and if you have not been able to get any, it does put you at a disadvantage for a lot of programs, because a lot of programs do want, or they either prefer or require that you have that US clinical experience. So you definitely want to keep trying to get it however you can. If you don't have US clinical experience, I would say that's something that's worth addressing in your personal statement, to talk about, maybe how you have attempted to get, you know that it's important and you've tried to get it, you just simply at this point don't have it. And there's other things you can do, right? You can, you can learn about what the healthcare system is like here and what US clinical experiences are like. And you can demonstrate in your personal statement that you've done everything you can to be as well prepared as possible without that experience. Personal statement general format, very straightforward, just left aligned paragraphs, single spaced. Don't indent your paragraphs. We don't need to start with, dear sir or madam, or dear program director. There's no greeting required, and there's also no salutation at the bottom. You don't need to sign off, sincerely with your name or anything like that. So very, very straightforward.
And I just also wanted to add to that. I've had a few people ask me to read their statements, and they start off with things like, "Oh, this is my name, so I am so and so." You really don't need to do that because it's attached to your application, and they will say your name at the top of it. So don't waste your word count on introducing yourself.
Yeah, and that's 100% correct. Your name should not make an appearance at all in your personal statement. And the same, honestly, is true of your medical school. Anything that's very easily accessible right in your application, you just don't need to include it. And that's because, like you said, that tiny little word count really goes quickly. So we want to save it for let's see. That might be it. A couple of thank yous. Thank you. We will post this on our IGTV that will be up shortly. Someone's asking, can we talk about extra LORs that we got? I'm not sure exactly. Oh, talk about them in the personal statement. It's not really necessary. You know, your letters of reference or letters of recommendation are their own documents. They stand alone and they speak for themselves. So it's really not necessary to talk about them, how you got them, or what they say in your personal statement. Even if you got extra letters of recommendation, it's just not something that needs to be talked about since it's a separate supporting document. Is research publication mandatory for internal medicine residency application? No, it's not. That's a simple answer. It's not mandatory. Yeah. You know, like we talked about, it's a bonus if you have some research experience, but it's definitely not mandatory. Tele Rotations. You know, Tele Rotations, we are going to be asking programs in our update this season whether or not they're considering Tele Rotations as U.S. clinical experience, and we're hoping to get, you know, great responses from the different programs so that if you do get a customized list from Match a Resident, you'll be able to tell which programs are going to consider it as USCE or not. You can talk about your telerotation in your personal statement, especially if you want to highlight how great of an experience it was. You know, it's obviously not the same as hands-on clinical experience just because you're not physically there, but that doesn't mean that it can't be the next best thing. So it's good to try to highlight why it was the next best thing. We have is mentioning previous visa issues in the PS a red flag? So that's a good question. Like, are visa issues a red flag? In and of themselves, they're not a red flag. It's, you know, either you have your J1 visa sponsorship from the ECFMG, and if you have that, you don't need to talk about it, or you don't, and you need the H1B visa sponsored by the institution that you're going to do your residency at. So it's kind of one thing or another. If visa issues caused you to have a gap year or caused you to take time off, then you can explain that, but it should just be very brief. It doesn't need to be, you know, the whole backstory and every detail that happened.
Yeah, just like a sentence or so, it's fine. Which is, again, another one of my things that I had to address. So.
Yeah, and you did so really concisely. Just this is what happened, and now we'll move on. Yeah. And that's the best approach. The next one says, what should be the minimum gap of graduation? I'm not sure I understand that one. What should be the minimum?
I think it's like what would look good if, you know, if I'm a graduate of like 2 years ago or like 5 years ago, what would programs consider a red flag?
You know, most programs do prefer recent graduates. So, you know, within either graduating within this upcoming cycle or just have graduated this past cycle. But I wouldn't say that there's a strong minimum or maximum. You know, a lot of the programs that we have data about in the system, they say, you know, that they prefer 5 years or less. Some say 3 years, some say 7 years, some say 10 years. So it really does vary from program to program. And as we said before, if you've been doing medically relevant work during those years off, it's not going to count against you as much as if you have not been. So if you're relevant, you've been gaining experience, you know, just play those things up and highlight them. And does being a PA or a nurse practitioner and then applying give you an edge? It can, because you've had, you know, maybe several years of experience working directly with patients and, you know, experience working with doctors from different specialties and things like that. So it definitely can. And like, if you're a non-traditional applicant, you're an older applicant, just because you have had a nursing career or a PA career, you know, that's one of those things that you definitely capitalize on and point out as a strength. And it truly is a strength to have had years of experience in the clinical setting in a different role. It gives you a different perspective than what a fresh graduate can possibly have. So yeah, that's definitely something important to include. And I think our last one here we already addressed is our Tele Rotations counted as USCE. We already talked about that one. So I think that covers everything we'd hoped to cover today
Mhm.
and then some. And as we already said, reach out, ask us questions. We will post the recording of this live on our IGTV at some point today, so you guys will be able to go back and access it. And we thank everybody for tuning in today.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, well, have a great day, Dr. Tan.
You too. Bye, everyone. See you later.
Bye.